The auction yard was filled with murmurs, not of cattle this time, but of people bidding for help, wives, workers, and widows. Among them stood a woman named Clara. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the ground, her dress worn but clean. The whispers followed her like shadows. "That's the barren one," someone said. "Her husband's family sent her here. Said she couldn't give him a child." Clara didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. Her husband's death hadn't freed her, it had only made her an object to be sold. They said she was a burden, and in a cruel twist of fate, she found herself on this platform, being auctioned off like livestock. In the back, leaning on a fence post, was a man named Samuel Holt. A widowed rancher, tall and broad, with silver creeping into his beard. He wasn't looking for a wife. He had buried one, long ago, and the ache of that loss had built walls around his heart stronger than any fence he ever mended. But something about Clara's quiet defiance caught his eye. When the bidding began, the voices were hesitant. No one wanted a woman who couldn't bear children. But Samuel's voice cut through the crowd. "I'll take her." The yard went silent. The auctioneer blinked. "You sure, Holt? You could have any." "I said I'll take her." And just like that, Clara's fate changed hands again. When they reached his ranch, she expected coldness. Men who bought women didn't usually come with kindness. But Samuel didn't touch her, didn't command her. He handed her a cup of coffee, pointed to a small cabin near the barn, and said quietly, "That'll be your space. You'll find linens and soap inside." That night, Clara sat by the window of that little cabin, staring out at the dark, endless sky. She waited for the inevitable, orders, demands, the weight of ownership. But none came. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel barely spoke to her beyond the necessities. Until one morning, after a storm, when he found her outside trying to lift a fallen fence post. Her hands were bleeding, her breath ragged, but she refused to stop. "What are you doing?" he barked, striding toward her. "Working," she said simply. "You paid for me. Least I can do is earn my keep." He took the post from her hands, driving it back into the earth with a few powerful strikes. "You don't owe me anything, Clara." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Everyone I've ever known told me otherwise." For the first time, Samuel saw not just a woman labeled barren, but a soul who had been broken, discarded, yet still standing. From that day, something shifted. She cooked for him, not out of duty but out of quiet gratitude. He started leaving small things by her door, books, seeds for her garden, a shawl for the cold nights. He began to look forward to her soft humming while she worked, to her laughter, rare, but warm as sunlight when it came. One evening, after supper, Clara stood by the porch railing, looking at the horizon painted in gold and crimson. "You never asked me," she said softly. "About what? Why they called me barren." He looked at her for a long time before replying. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said, her voice trembling. "Because it's not true. I lost a child once. Early. They said it was my fault. Said I wasn't made to be a mother. Then when my husband died, his family needed someone to blame for everything that went wrong. So they blamed me." Samuel stepped closer. "And you believed them?" "I didn't have a reason not to." He shook his head, his gaze steady and full of something she hadn't seen in years, respect. "You don't owe anyone proof of your worth, Clara. Not a man, not a family, not a world that measures women by wombs. You hear me?" Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. From that night on, their silence turned softer, almost sacred. They shared dinners, laughter, stories by the fire. Samuel never once reached for her, but he was always there, steady, kind, unyielding in his quiet care. One winter, he fell sick. Clara stayed by his bedside, wiping his brow, reading aloud even when his eyes were closed. He'd whisper her name sometimes, not as a plea but as a prayer. When he recovered, he found her asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still holding his. He didn't let go. "Clara," he said quietly when she stirred. "You stayed." She smiled faintly. "Where else would I go?" He took a deep breath. "You could have left. You had the papers. You're free now." She looked into his eyes, tired but certain. "Freedom doesn't always mean leaving, Samuel. Sometimes it means choosing to stay." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then stay. Not because I bought you, not because you owe me, but because I don't need children, Clara." I need you. The words fell between them like rain on dry earth. She stared at him, her heart trembling, then whispered, and if I can't give you anything? You already have, he said softly. You gave me peace. The years that followed were quiet but full. The ranch grew, the seasons turned, and laughter slowly returned to the house. Clara planted roses by the porch. She said they reminded her that even thorns could bloom. Samuel would sit beside her every evening, his hand finding hers, their silence saying everything words never could. One spring morning, as the sun rose over the fields, Clara stood in the doorway watching him saddle his horse. He looked up at her, smiling that familiar, steady smile. In that moment, she realized she had not been bought. She had been found. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't someone's burden or mistake. She was loved, not for what she could give, but simply for who she was. The years had been kind to them, though time marked its quiet passage on their faces and hands. Clara had come to know every corner of the ranch, every creak of the old boards, every sunrise that painted the fields gold. Samuel had long since stopped calling her Miss Clara, and simply said her name with a tenderness that made her heart pause each time. Their life together was not filled with grand gestures or lavish comforts, but with the kind of peace that only grows between two souls who have learned the value of stillness. In the mornings, they drank coffee on the porch, speaking little. Words were no longer needed to fill the spaces between them. In the evenings, he'd fix small things around the house while she baked, her humming drifting through the open windows. Sometimes, at night, Samuel would find her sitting by the fire with her knitting, lost in thought. He'd ask, "What are you thinking about?" And she'd smile faintly, "That I never thought I'd feel at home again." And he would simply nod, because he knew. He had once lived in that same emptiness, the space between loss and hope. There were children from nearby ranches who would often come by, sometimes chasing a runaway calf, sometimes delivering messages. Clara always had something ready for them, a slice of pie, a warm drink, or a word of kindness. They began calling her Aunt Clara, and she'd laugh softly, though her eyes always glimmered with emotion. She had never asked for that title, but she carried it gently, like a gift. One autumn evening, after the harvest, Samuel found her standing by the garden. The roses she planted years ago had grown wild, their scent filling the cool air. He came up beside her, his hat in his hand, his eyes tracing the horizon. "They've taken root stronger than I thought," he said. "So have I," she whispered. He turned to her then, taking her hand in his. His fingers, rough and calloused, closed around hers like they belonged there. "I never told you enough," he said quietly. "You changed this place, Clara. You brought life back to it." She shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No, Samuel. You gave me something I didn't think I deserved, a chance to start over without shame." He smiled, the lines at his eyes deepening. "Guess we both found what we didn't know we were looking for." As the sun sank low, he placed his arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the last light fade into the horizon. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of everything they had built: trust, tenderness, and the quiet, steadfast love that didn't need promises to endure. That night, before blowing out the lamp, Clara looked at him and said softly, "If I had known peace could look like this, I would have stopped running sooner." Samuel reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You were never running, Clara. You were finding your way home."